Russia keeps hitting Kyiv and other cities with drones and missiles. There is no sign of a ceasefire, not even a hint. Instead, Moscow talks about a war that could last 20 years and spreads new threats and old propaganda. What's really going on? Is this bluff or long-term strategy? And how far could Putin go? We ask Professor of International Security Affairs of the National Defense University, PeterEltsov. Peter, hi.
Hi, very nice to see you again. And yes, I think it's a strategy, and I think there is absolutely no desire from Putin or Russia in general to have a ceasefire. They want more land. If you think actually realistically, what did they get in 3 years of war? This so-called powerful army, the biggest country in the world. What did they get? They get some maybe 20% of territory, but they actually did not get a single very significant big Ukrainian city. I'm not saying that Mariupol is not significant, but still Kharkov, Mykolaiv, Odessa, all of these cities which they call Novorossiya or Malorossiya, so which they see as historic Russia, they're still under the control of the Ukrainian army. I don't believe they can stop there. They want to stop there. They ideally, as I have written before, they want all of Ukraine except for Galiciana. So basically to leave Ukraine as a landlocked country in Galiciana. So they want Kyiv, they want at least entire Ukraine east of the Dnieper River. They basically want what Solzhenitsyn called, historic Russia in some of his writings. And I don't know if they're ready to fight for 20 years, but those analogies with the Northern War of Peter the Great are, of course, outrageous. In political science, now there are theories which call for so-called new medievalism. They're basically coming back to the 1800s, 1900s, 1700s with those territorial grabs. Yes, I don't think they have any desire to stop.
Yeah, but Russia seems to be, celebrating as Donald Trump expresses open sympathy and distances himself from the negotiation process. How should the West interpret this shift? As a green light for Moscow to escalate? Because you probably heard that Russia is, extremely attacking, especially Kyiv for the last 2 nights.
Yes, I heard about it, and it actually wasn't even much reported in the Western news. Well, I would not say that Trump expresses a sympathy. Yes, he seems to be somewhat fascinated with Putin, and of course his envoy Witkovits is even more so. But what to do is difficult to say. I think a lot depends on Europe now. I think Europe really got a realization that for the first time since World War II, they need to be together. And of course, there are parts of Europe where there is also kind of if not sympathy, but understanding for Putin or lack of desire to help Ukraine. I think a lot depends really on Germany today, because it's the most powerful country in Europe, and they seem to be the current, the new chancellor is definitely wants to help Ukraine. A lot depends on the United Kingdom, France, the allies like Finland and Sweden. So yes, America, the reality is that whatever happens, the United States is not going to be as helpful as it was under the Biden administration. But I still see that there is a chance if Putin really upsets Trump, because Trump also clearly has a very big ego, he may renew aid in one way or another, because there is still a number of Republicans. Remember that only about 100 Republicans voted against the aid last time, and all Democrats supported. And some very senior Republicans, like Lindsey Graham, are very pro-Ukrainian. So I do think there is a chance, but unfortunately with this administration, you can't predict anything. I absolutely not ready to give any predictions what Donald Trump is going to do tomorrow.
We discussed that before, that everybody who can predict what they're going to do next, they are lying, because nobody knows.
Exactly right.
So, Peter, but still,
I can predict that Putin will continue. I can absolutely, I'm confident that for Putin, it's Some of his former her allies who fled to the West actually say that he sees it as kind of a thing of his life to restore some smaller version of the Russian Empire. I don't think he wants any Muslim countries because they're religiously very bigoted, but he definitely wants Ukraine and Belarus.
Well, it seems like they want Ukraine much more than other countries.
Yes, because Ukraine...
because we are resisting, right? Because we are resisting.
No, I think it's also, well, you're resisting, but he, of course, didn't expect that resistance. Neither the West expected that kind of resistance. If you remember, in the beginning of the war, were all these predictions that the Russians will be in Kyiv in like a week maximum. And that's what I heard even from the US generals. No, the issue is Ukraine is more complicated because the Russian nationalist idea sees Ukraine as the beginning of Russia. It doesn't give like any agency to Ukraine. Kyiv is Russia, is the beginning, is, as you know, the mother of Russian towns, as every Russian kid studies at school. Think about it, the director of the famous movie, very popular film, The Dog's Heart, made on Bulgakov's novel, they say Bulgakov, of course, lived in Kyiv, and the director of that film lived in Kyiv, and now he openly, I was shocked, I just recently found out that he says, that Kyiv is a 100% Russian city and the war will be over only when Kyiv will come back to Russia. So that's what people think. The same with Odessa, the same with Nikolaev, the same with Kharkiv. These are all seen by the Russian people, the majority of the Russian people, as historic Russia. They don't think about that even about Makhachkala, which is part of Russia, right?
Yes.
So it's very different.
Yeah, but still, why
it's scary, but it is...
But why do you think Putin's envoys and Putin himself reportedly saying to Ukraine that they are ready to fight over than 20 years as they did before with Sweden, as a, you know, and they are just, why are they talking about Sweden as a precedent? Is that a psychological pressure? Is that a really serious signal for us?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure they will be able to fight for 20 years. The war will be over as soon as they have to do conscription.
Yeah.
So there are no protests in Russia because they use, they're evil, but they're smart. They use criminals and the poorest levels of society, those people who are ready to go and die for money. And the criminals, the Soviet army, the Russian army never used criminals on that scale. Even if you remember Stalin in the beginning of World War II, he used some of the prisoners, but they were mostly political prisoners because he knew in his heart that political prisoners are good people. They're not real criminals. So he uses real hardcore criminals, rapists, murderers, and so forth. Do they want them to come back to Russia? No, so they don't care if they die in the battlefield. But the war will be over if they have to resort to regular army. Because if children, boys from Moscow, St. Petersburg, Saratov, just regular boys from like regular families will have to go, it will change the story. Now they don't care because it's kind of war doesn't exist for them. So I don't think they will last for 20 years, but why they're using this analogy, Russia is in the craziest stage of nationalism. I actually wrote a piece a couple of years ago on the magazine The National Interest where I said that Russia has never in its history, whether Russia or the Soviet Union, fought such a horrible, unjust and disgusting war. So they need this nationalist fever to justify why they're doing that. And they are bringing back some insane historical examples which have no relevance today. Ironically, a couple of years ago, I think one of the Swedish diplomats, he said, we are actually thankful to you, Russia, that you won the Battle of Poltava because it laid the foundation for us not to be an empire any longer and become a normal European democratic states. I think that was a brilliant answer.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we will come back to that in a few more moments. But I mean, as long as you touched Germany, do you think it is realistic to believe that Ukraine could successfully lead peace negotiation without such U.S. involvement as it was before? I mean, who can fill that strategic void?
So, yes, I think Ukraine can. and maybe even it will be better with the help of Europeans if the United States completely withdraws. The main thing is for Ukraine to survive militarily, politically. So whoever can help, I think Ukraine can also try to work with South Korea and Japan, particularly because North Korea is now also involved in war. I try to find new allies, but Ukraine definitely can fight. I have a deep faith. Think about it, that even after World War II, as you know, Ukrainian resistance continued for about 12 years. And that was under Stalin's Soviet Union, when the Red Army occupied half of Europe, and there was really not much help for Ukrainian resistance, maybe a little bit from the CIA and some intelligence services. So, yes, I think Ukraine can definitely deal directly with Russia with the help of Europeans. The main thing is to survive militarily, to continue, and with Godspeed, I think it will happen.
Yeah, and coming back to the justifying a war, I mean, what is happening inside Russia itself? I mean, its economy, internal stability, evolving propaganda, and how this affects the Kremlin's ability to sustain the war. Because this May marked the 80th anniversary of the end of Second World War in Europe, and Putin's regime is, actively abusing and falsifying that legacy to justify today's war. How dangerous is this historical manipulation, and how Russia does it shape, how does it shape Russia's ideology and foreign policy today?
So the first part of the question about ideology, how they justify it. Like, I'll tell you, whatever they do, they of course try to portray Ukraine as like whatever fascist state, illegitimate regime, all of that. To me, the most amazing thing, and which I argue with my colleagues here in the US and Europe, people actually support Putin. And on that, I also strongly disagree with some of the leading Russian opposition figures. For example, I recently talked to Leonid Volkov, and I follow Kara-Murza, like after his release from prison. These are, of course, courageous people. I support them, but I think they're delusional because they think that the Russian people don't support Putin, or there is a very strong movement against Putin. Yes, some don't, but it's a small percentage. I'll give you like a personal example, which struck me tremendously. I left Russia in 1994, over 30 years ago. And the only job I had there, like after graduating from the university, I was a high school teacher in a very prestigious school in St. Petersburg. And as you know, that was probably the freest time, the late 1980s, early 1990s, the freest time in the entire history, I would say, of Russia and the Soviet Empire, maybe like somewhere in 1917, between February and October, it was also relatively free. So I kept in touch with my students. I taught history, and we read like all this anti-Soviet literature. We talk about the evils of the Russian Empire and so forth. So I reconnected with this class. They're only maybe 7, 8 years younger than me, so in their late 40s. And I was absolutely stunned that in the beginning of the war, half of them not just didn't care, they vehemently supported the war and completely believed in that propaganda. They started talking to each other. So clearly, I'm not going to believe any polls coming from Russia, but I got a true information from the demographics. Say it's 30 individuals of whom I thought as a creme de la creme of St. Petersburg intelligentsia, people grew up like next to the Hermitage Museum. It was stunning to me to find out, and still it's happening. And more frightening, in the beginning of the war, they didn't talk to each other. Now there's two groups, they talk to each other. They just decided, let's not talk about the war like it doesn't exist. That shows you really well in what kind of horrid, sick disease the Russian society is now.
Yeah, you're completely...
This is the first part of the question about ideology. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you wanted to talk about, I don't know where to get started about the use of the war. My own grandfather was a famous playwright and died during the siege of Leningrad in front of my 7-year-old mother from starvation. At the same time, my grandmother is buried in Lviv, and her brother fought in Ukrainian insurgent army. So I know the war well, but what they're doing now is disgusting. If you look at the history, like after World War II, the Soviet Union never really had military parades on 9th of May. They did them on the 7th of November, the day of the Communist Revolution. It was a pretty modest holiday, usually with an orchestra, some World War II songs, the veterans. Stalin, many report he was afraid of the veterans. He didn't want them to get together because they had a very different story of the war. Many of these people who liberated Europe, they ended up in the Gulag after the war because they saw how the Germans lived and would compare how people lived in Nazi Germany comparatively to life in the Soviet Union. Putin even had guts in one of his interviews years ago to say that the Soviet Union would have won a war without Ukraine and without basically anyone else. And Nikita Khrushchev, in his memoirs, famously wrote that Stalin, in his inner circle after the war, said that without the help of the United States, the war would have been lost. Hitler would have been in Moscow in December of 41. That's per Stalin. And Khrushchev, who was also, of course, participating in war in the leadership positions, he says that he 100% agrees with that. So Putin now claims that everything could have been done single-handedly without the help of other Soviet republics. And it's for him to say, in particular about Ukraine, which lost a tremendous amount of people in World War II, paid a tremendous sacrifice. Think about it, the Soviet Union, they call Ukrainians the fascists. They never advertised Babi Yar. When Babi Yar, the famous poem, was written by Yevtushenko, he was banned from Kiev by that time Soviet government. When Shostakovich composed that famous symphony, and by the way, I just saw that it's now being performed quite regularly in Kiev, on particularly the anniversaries of Babi Yar. So the Soviet government, the Russian government, was hiding those atrocities. So now they're portraying like the war became this sacred cow, and how many veterans are left there? So it's extremely dishonest what they're doing with that war, with the use of that war, that it's almost the only thing they can be proud of. And of course, they deny openly, Medinsky denies that there were parades in Poland, like after the division of Poland. So they deny basically the alliance of the Soviet Union with the Nazi Germany from 39 to 41. So it's just a bunch of lies, a complete misrepresentation of the facts, and a very unfortunate thing. But people believe in it.
But still, Peter, after years and hundreds of years of attacking other countries, how Russia started this disgusting war, as you said. I mean, I'm in shock when it's 21st century and people want to just enjoy life and drink their, latte and travel the world. This country is absolutely not like others.
You're right. I'm thinking that the miscalculation was huge. They thought that they'll be in Kiev in 2014, they occupied Crimea. So they thought there would be no resistance. And unfortunately, in the West, people also thought that would be an easy 2 weeks war. What they didn't understand, unfortunately, they didn't understand at all the formation of identities. So they didn't realize that if people speak Russian language, it doesn't mean that they're Russian. I know plenty of Kazakh people, particularly of my generation, who don't speak any Kazakh. And even their first president, Nazarbayev, spoke pretty poor Kazakhs as a result of Russification. So that doesn't mean that they're not Kazakh. They are Kazakh, whose native language happened to be Russian. So the same happened in Ukraine, particularly in the eastern parts of Ukraine, and Kiev, as you know, too, was pretty much a Russian-speaking city. So they thought that these people are Russian. That's a complete stupidity. If you know, there is this commentator in Russia, Sergei Markov. He once said on this show by Skabeva and Popov, he said that, do you realize these are the Russians fighting against us? These are brainwashed Russians, because he heard that some people in the front line among the Ukrainians speak Russian. Very often, I actually have a couple of Ukrainian military students. They tell me that they do it sometimes to disguise the Russian army. It doesn't mean that they don't speak Ukrainian. So, but Markov was calling them brainwashed Russians. So he couldn't even think that even if these people maybe speak Russian as one of their languages, they're actually 100% Ukrainian. They also don't realize, any anthropologists know that the war is the most important factor of identity. That's when your national identity is solidified. So as much as it can sound horrible, but in this sense, Putin and this crazy aggression solidified Ukrainian nations, solidified Ukrainian identity, regardless of what language you speak. They just don't understand it. They never could predict that. Now I think they probably do, but it's too late. And I think this is one of the main reasons. They thought that it would be super easy. And another reason, this, I guess, is historical revisionism. They think that it's their land. They think in terms of, like, I don't know, 19th century. By this logic, following this logic, Mexico should start a war with the United States and get back California and all of the American Southwest, because it used to be Mexico.
Yeah,
before
absolutely.
the
I think that Russia is
war.
I think Russia is now confused by their own lie and myth they were creating through propaganda for ages. And now that, I mean, I don't...
Yes, they start believing in that.
Yeah, they started to believe in that. Yes, that's the case.
But the frightening thing, which, as I gave you an example of my former students in high school in St. Petersburg, the same with intellectuals. They're genuine intellectuals.
Same with intellectuals,
of course,
absolutely.
we can say, like, someone like Kirkorov maybe does it for money, maybe. Because a pop star, he can never make any money in the West. He's not known there. But think about individuals like Yuri Bashmet, a wonderful classical musician, an educated man. He could find a job in the West. He was also, I think, an honorary member of a Lviv conservatory. They took away his title. He not only supports Putin, he vehemently supports him. He literally said in one of the events in Kremlin, I just want to say, I really, really, really love my president. I think even Putin was embarrassed. I think I just brought you the example of this film director, Bortko, who is an extremely talented man. And he says that we will need to be in Kyiv and the war won't end until we return to my hometown. Apparently, he grew up in Kyiv.
So we definitely know who are the brainwashed Russians.
So they know exactly, but these people have access, they can travel, they're highly educated, they're also talented but you think of Wagner, the famous, the beloved Hitler's composer. He was an incredible pathological anti-Semite. So these people are sick, yeah. And they are persuading, they're genuinely, I do believe, again, unlike the Russian oppositions, many people among the Russian opposition claim that people forced to do things. Nikita Mikhalkov is not forced to do anything. He is doing what he believes is the right thing to do. And the same with some of these intellectuals. Even you would think, even Alexander Rosenbaum, the famous singer.
You know what I've recently heard about these two actors, two brothers who were acting in electronic movie, and I guess they're also
twins.
they are on the front line, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh God, that's that's a movie from my childhood. I remember, I don't remember their name, but it's not surprising to me. You know, like I stopped talking. I'm a pretty politically balanced person because of my job. I have to be very, very tolerant and careful, but I lost it. In the beginning of the war, I really disconnected from several people with whom I kept in touch for years and years in Russia. Of course, I can't go there anymore, but it's just incredible how powerful this nationalist message is.
Absolutely.
Incredible.
Absolutely. Peter, The Independent recently wrote a piece with the title Putin's Endgame in Ukraine and Why It Won't Finish There. Do you share that assessment? What evidence do you see that Putin's ambitions extend beyond Ukraine?
So I do think he definitely wants at some point Belarus to be part of Russia too, because Belarus, in his view, is Russia. So it's Ukraine, Belarus, Russia is historic Russia. So he controls Belarus completely. So, like, I don't know how he's going to do that. Under Lukashenko, it's pretty much a de facto now, like almost part of Russia. I think he will think of a way to take over the euro as well. He may think of Moldova because he sees their whole concept of Holy Rus, Svятая Rus, which used to be, in fact, another ideological factor in the Russian Empire. It was a very private, personal concept. It didn't have a political connotation. Peter the Great or Catherine the Great did not go and conquer lands and say they're going to be part of the Holy Rus. Now, Patriarch, who is for the first time in Russian history to become basically part of the state, which blesses this war. He said, he went to Moldova and said that Moldova is part of Holy Rus, because as you know, it's mostly an Orthodox country. It's of course not a Slavic language, so I do think, and he said, it's part of Holy Rus, and I hope that your political orientation will follow this direction. They're very upset with the recent result of the election in Moldova. They, of course, call it illegitimate and so forth because they've selected a pretty pro-Western, pro-European person. So I do think these countries, yes, Belarus, Moldova. I'm most skeptical about Baltic states. It's, of course, part of NATO, but we don't know what's going to happen with NATO. I mean, there are even voices in the United States for the United States to withdraw from NATO. But I do share those fears. But as long as they're stuck in Ukraine, of course, they're not going to do like anything else right now. But if they were to achieve what they would definitely consider moving further places in Europe, or at least control Europe in a hybrid way. If they manage to put their candidates in power, that's of course would be like another solution for them to spread their influence.
Yeah, and I've heard that the Russian authorities are going to send some peace memorandum to Ukraine. Peter, I have a question. Why do they actually was going in all this negotiation process? Why do they need that?
Well, they want to show it's a kind of circus. They want to show the legality. You remember before the war, I believe it was November, December 2021, they gave a suggestion, an ultimatum to NATO to prevent the war, which was ludicrous. They said, like, you have to withdraw the infrastructure of NATO to whatever, 97. I mean, you have to ask, it's not even up to the US, you have to ask like other members of NATO and the countries like Poland, Romania. So they want to show something, they'll give you, some suggestions. They say, hey, retrieve from these 4 regions of Ukraine, which they've already announced in their constitution as part of Russia through those sham referendum. But I think that's even not enough. I don't think if they propose, I predict that they will ask for Odessa, Mykolaiv, Kharkiv, Dnipro. They will say that needs to be part of Russia. They basically want, I think they will want all sort of everything east of the Dnieper River. Kherson, of course. So, I mean, that will be their request.
They are super delusional. They are not learning from their own mistakes. I'm not trying to underestimate the enemy, but in this case, they're super delusional.
Yes, of course they're delusional. And imagine, even if they occupy, like imagine a really scary scenario, they occupy more land. I mean, what they are counting on to have peace there, they don't expect like underground resistance and so forth. as I've already brought an example of late 1940s, 1950s, I think the resistance continues all the way into mid 50s in Ukraine, in Estonia, so in the Soviet Union. So, I mean, they are delusional. I don't know if they know what they're asking for. And of course, the saddest thing, the amazing thing, that no one cares about casualties.
Yeah. And you know, for the end, I want to ask you the question that I'm recently thinking a lot about. Do the world have done enough after the more than 3 years of a full-scale invasions? And particularly sanctions, they haven't cut off Russia's ability to fund the war, but they have, limited it to some extent. From your perspective, how effective are sanctions today, and what we can do, what the world can do more?
So the world could have done much, much more in many ways, and it's not only in terms of the military aid. I mean, there are people like you, of course, in Ukraine. I think everyone knows Tim Snyder, a famous professor from Yale University.
Absolutely,
he just left Yale. He speaks Ukrainian and a big supporter of Ukraine. He suggested that the West should have given nuclear weapons to Ukraine. But even if not that, what was really upsetting to me is a complete loss of political rhetoric and political will. I'm thinking of Ronald Reagan, who passed his famous joke when he said on a talk show, he said, "I've just outlawed the Soviet Union. We're going to start bombing in 5 minutes." It freaked out the entire Soviet establishment. Of course, the army, the nuclear forces, the Navy, like everybody. I don't know, people still argue that it was intended this way or intended as a joke, as a test. But what do we say? We say nothing. Putin says, "I'll nuke you." He constantly says, "I'll do this and this." He said once, "What do you think if you send one nuclear weapon towards Russia, I'll respond with one?" He says, "No, I'll respond with dozens." The thing is, no one responds even to him. I very much supported President Biden in his support of Ukraine. Why he didn't respond that way? Why there is this absolute weakness of the leaders, even as much as I like also Boris Johnson. He was constantly saying, "No escalation, no escalation, no escalation." You don't have to escalate, but you don't have to say that. Say, "You're going to escalate, we are going to escalate in response." Political rhetoric can be very powerful. Largely, the Cold War was won exactly over that political rhetoric. Like Reagan called famously the Soviet Union an evil empire, was constantly threatening a war. Same was with Thatcher. Same with this Pope, the Polish Pope, John Paul II. So much more could have been done militarily, because in the beginning, of course, you were not getting certain types of weapons. Eventually, it was happening. Much more could have been done in terms of very affirmative political rhetoric. I believe in the power of ideology, of words. That's what largely destroyed the Soviet Union. Why the US president, the British prime minister, never made a good speech about several speeches about the war in Ukraine. To give credit to Chancellor Scholz, he gave a very famous speech. It's called the Zeitenwende, the change of times, on the 27th of February of 2022, just 3 days after the beginning of full-scale war. That was a very powerful speech where he said the world will be never the same again. Yes, much more could have been done and still needs to be done.
But is the world risks with its soft power to bending to Putin? You know, this Boris Johnson, who was super accurate, Joe Biden, who was always afraid of nuclear power attacks. And, so, I mean, it has to lead to something.
Yes, Putin is not suicidal. He's not going to nuke the Western countries. He knows he'll get a response.
Peter,
So, like, I don't understand why there is this fear.
You know that, and I know that, and a lot of people know that. But, I mean, people in the White House and some people in Europe sitting in their own cabinets don't believe that.
Yeah, they do fear that he's going to actually attack in a nuclear way. I know, and I don't know how to change that, but it needs to be definitely, I wish it could be changed. But unfortunately, the reality is not there, and Putin is winning this information war. He's winning the war of rhetoric, political rhetoric. He is also, unfortunately, in Europe and in the US, there are a lot of people who buy also kind of his explanations for the war. So it's both the war of ideas, as we live at the age of extremely powerful, irregular, hybrid warfare, which goes all the way along with irregular conventional war.
Mm-hmm. Peter, thank you so much for such a deep, bright conversation. You were, you know, a brilliant expert to me, and I hope to see you again in our studio soon.
Definitely. I hope next time we talk, we'll have some better news.
I hope for that too. Yeah, fingers crossed.
Yeah. Thank you. It was great to talk to you again.
Thank you.
Natalia, thank you. Have a great day.